Good morning again, Green Spring. Today is May the 3rd, 2018. Can you believe it's May already? It's beautiful out there. I hope you get out and do a little walking and see the flowers and so forth. They're beautiful. But today we're talking on our Who's Who program with Marvin Wagner. And you've probably seen Marvin Wagner around the campus. He was in the choristers. He plays duplicate bridge. He organized the presentations on historical events such as wars and revolutions, which are ongoing. And he's a guide on the Green Spring Walking Tour. And he's also the president of the Democratic Club. So Marvin, thank you very much for coming on Who's Who today.
My pleasure.
And I'd like to start out by talking a little bit about your current family, what your daughters and sons and whatever they're doing and where they are.
Four children, 2 girls and 2 boys. And that itself is an interesting story. My wife and I were married, and we had a number of years together, and we decided to have a family, only it wasn't working. And ultimately we decided to adopt a child, and we adopted a little girl. Now, in New York at that time, and this was back in the late 50s, you could only adopt a child through your religious affiliations. And being Jewish, we had one agency that was available to get a child to adopt. And at that time, in the Jewish population, there weren't that many Jewish children available, so you had to be a little special to get one. And we
was that local in New York, or
the New York metropolitan area?
And you couldn't choose a Jewish child from anywhere in the U.S.
No, at that point.
Yeah.
And so we were accepted to get a child, and we did. We got our first child. My wife immediately became pregnant.
Isn't that the case?
And we had a boy. A couple of years go by, and we decided, well, let's expand the family. And we tried to have another child, and that wasn't working. And so, well, okay, let's adopt another little girl. So we went back to the agency, and they said, you got to be kidding. You have 2 children now. We have people that don't have any kids at all, and forget about it. We said, well, okay. Just coincidentally, my wife was listening to the radio at the time, and there was an announcement from Nassau County. We were living in Long Island at the time, that they changed the rules, and that at that time, if you wanted to adopt a child of your own religion, you didn't have to go through the agencies. You can adopt directly from the county. So my wife immediately called and said, yeah, we'd like to adopt a Jewish child. And they said, okay. And so we adopted a 3rd child. She became pregnant again immediately.
It worked.
And we had another boy.
Yeah.
So that's how we had 2 girls and 2 boys.
That's a good story.
We also have 8 grandchildren.
Oh boy.
And 1 great-grandchild. Nice little boy.
And he's a pistol.
Oh yeah, he's hot stuff.
How old is he?
He's 10 months now.
Oh, 10 months, okay.
Yeah.
So he hasn't turned into a pistol yet?
Not yet, not yet. Yeah, he's a very nice little boy.
Yeah.
He's up in Richmond.
We're down where do they live?
In Richmond.
All of the kids?
No. I have 1 daughter here in Fairfax, 1 daughter who is on her way up to New England, and a son in Richmond and another son down in South Carolina.
Oh, okay. So they're spread over, but you do have 1
Yeah,
here. That's
right, yeah.
That's good. And does she have any children?
Yeah, she has 2 children.
Okay, so you have some grandchildren around.
Well, yeah. Mm-hmm.
That's great. Okay. All right. Well, let's go back to your beginnings.
Okay.
You were born in Brooklyn.
Brooklyn, New York.
Brooklyn, and as I recall, from a lot of stories of Brooklyn, it could be a pretty rough place.
We didn't even have it. That tree that grew in Brooklyn,
Yeah.
we didn't even have one in our neighborhood.
You didn't have a tree, huh?
It was purely tenement houses, hundreds and hundreds of people. I'm sure we had as many people on our block as you had in your whole town in Southwest Virginia.
I don't doubt that.
But
well, I don't know. We had 3,500 in town.
That's about what we had on
That's
our
about
block.
what you- okay.
But the thing was, everybody in my neighborhood was poor. So we didn't know anything else other than people are poor. And that's the way we grew up.
And so you were still happy.
Oh, yeah.
You had play. Okay.
Sure, right. Somewhat difficult times. There were times when we went to sleep hungry.
Yeah.
But still, it was not an impossible situation. We still look forward to what could be. And fortunately, they built the first, they being New York City, built its first housing project in Williamsburg, where we lived. It was called the Williamsburg Project.
Oh, okay.
And we were able to move into that. And it was completely different from the tenements that we had been living in.
New houses, new.
Everything was new,
yeah.
and the people, and it was a good choice.
Yeah.
It was a good opportunity for us.
Well, how about your schooling? And you went to grade school in Brooklyn, I presume. Is it?
Right. We went through elementary school, and then they had a junior high school, and I'll explain why that was important. At that point, you had to make a choice of going into either an academic trail or a trade school.
Yeah.
And my mother said, you can't go to an academic school because we don't have any money. You got to go to trade school, and you got to get a job for us to live.
What, did your mother have a job? Or your dad have a job? Or?
No, my mother. This was Depression days.
Yeah.
You know, and
Okay.
women certainly didn't. Men didn't have jobs.
Yeah.
Certainly women didn't. And we scraped. In fact, for a while we were on welfare.
Yeah.
So I'm aware of what welfare was. And when I was about 11 years old, I remember taking these food stamps to the local grocer. And I was so embarrassed.
Now, food stamp, did they have a food stamp program?
They have food stamps part of the welfare program.
This was New York then?
Yeah, New York City,
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
And I was terribly embarrassed. So the next day I went back to the grocer and I said, look, can I have a job carrying groceries or doing whatever I can? And this I was 12 years old.
Yeah.
And that's when I started working.
So he gave you a job?
Yeah, he
Good
gave me a
for him.
job.
Okay.
And then the next year, I went up. There's an area called the Catskill Mountains in New York.
Well familiar.
Right. There's also an area was at that time a Jewish area where they had hotels and all that kind of stuff.
Remember the name of the place?
Oh, dozens of
Dozens
places,
of them
dozens
up
of
there,
hotels
yeah.
and
Yeah, okay.
little rooming houses. And what people did was you go up there and you work as either a busboy or a waiter, and you live there and you got tips, and you save that money because you didn't spend anything, everything, you know. And for the next 10 years, every summer, I was going up to the Catskills and working as a waiter. And that was the only way we could survive.
Yeah.
So that was very important in our lives.
So you were pretty much the breadwinner then, huh?
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay.
And then I went to trade school. I went to a school called the New York School of Printing.
Yeah. Oh.
And it was in Manhattan, and we lived in Brooklyn, and I had to take the train. I was 13, 14 years old.
A subway.
Subway, yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm. And I had to commute each day. At the end, in my senior year, my English teacher took me aside and said, Marvin, you got a brain. What are you doing here? I said, I had no choice. He said, well, look, let's see if we can get you into academia, some kind of profession.
Now this is junior year of high school.
My senior year of high school.
Senior year of high school, okay.
Yeah. Now, when you go to a trade school, you do not take many academic courses.
Yeah.
No language, no math, other than they call printer's math, which is different from regular math. And we had no regents. Now, to go to college, you normally need regents credits to get into a normal college
This is a New York requirement.
in New York.
Yeah.
But there was a school in upstate New York that you can go to if you want to become a teacher. And they had two classifications. One was a elementary school teacher and the other was a trade school teacher. So we figured out that I can get up to that school, enter as a trade school person, and then switch over to become an elementary school person, which is what I wanted. And during that time, excuse me, I learned that there were some schools, like Long Island University, that had a relatively low threshold of requirements to get in. And I had certain credits from junior high school that I didn't realize. And the Army also gave credits, or the school took credits from the Army. And I discovered that I had enough credits to get into Long Island University. What I lacked was the Regents credits, which were required. So
now you're a senior in high school, and this is what you're thinking.
Right. So I joined the Army in 1946 so that I could get the GI Bill. It was still available. And then when I was stationed in Long Island, in Governor's Island, Fort J, I was in the military police, and I was able to go to Knight High School in New York and take these Regents credits and take the exams. And by that, doing all of this, I was able to get enough credits to get into Long Island University.
Good.
And then I spent 2 years there.
That was a pretty rough road to go.
It was.
And you really had to map it out pretty carefully.
And you had to be lucky too. Things, luck played a big part of it. But yes, it required a lot of work, and I worked all the way through high school and all the way through college and law school. And then I became a lawyer. Yeah.
So you got you graduated from Long Island. Did you graduate from Long
No,
Island?
you only needed 2 years at that time to go to law school.
And then you went to the Brooklyn
Law School.
Brooklyn Law School.
And then when I was here, I went to Georgetown Law School and got my master's in law.
So, but you graduated from law school in about 53, got married in 54.
53. I got married in 54.
Yeah. And you started practicing law in Brooklyn, or?
Yeah. It's an interesting story. I had a job up in Manhattan in a law firm, and they started me with a huge salary, $25 a week.
Boy.
$25 a week.
Well, that's more than you made in the Army.
That's true. And my wife and I decided we were going to get married in January of 54, and I went to my employers and said, look, I'd like to take a week off. I want to go on honeymoon. And they said, no. I said, wait a minute. This is, my honeymoon. No, I'm sorry, you can't take off. Well, then I left that firm. After the honeymoon, I joined another firm in Brooklyn, $25 a week. And then about 6 months, we lived with my in-laws. We moved to Long Island in Levittown, New York.
Oh, okay.
Our first house cost all of $6,900, the whole thing.
This was
54.
54.
And I got a GI mortgage.
But yeah, $6,000 was a whole lot of money.
Well, almost $7,000.
It was all your life in front of you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I got a GI mortgage through the GI Bill, with nothing down, and a couple of bucks a month.
Yeah. Well, my first house in '57 cost me $13,000.
There you go.
And that was my life ahead of me too, and a GI Bill and the same.
That's
thing.
right. Sure.
Yeah. So you settled in Levittown, and you became a defense attorney or a prosecutor?
No, I started a law practice.
Oh, you
One of the
started your
things.
own private law practice.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's very difficult to establish your own law practice in New York City.
Okay.
There are so many lawyers there as it is, and everybody has their own lawyer. But if you move to an area that's new, like Long Island was new, and you put up a shingle, which I did, everybody on the block and everybody around there, they don't necessarily have lawyers. And pretty soon I had developed my own law practice.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
And that was more than 25 a week.
Not much more. My wife had to work.
I see.
Started as a teacher in Long Island, and she earned $2,500 a year.
Okay.
So not much more, but we managed.
$2,500 a year, that's about what I made as a second lieutenant.
That's right.
Yeah. Okay. So you're in Levittown, New York. How long did you stay there?
I stayed there until 1970, and I was approached by the Department of Transportation to come to Washington to head the Office of Alcohol and Highway Safety. I had developed somewhat of a specialty in New York.
Before we get to that, did you have any interesting cases as a young lawyer? Or they're just running?
I had more interesting cases later on, if you want me to go into it.
Okay.
All right, just a couple of stories. I was very much involved in the alcohol and highway safety area, and I was doing a lot of assigned counsel work, and I was assigned a case on drunk driving. And I said, no, I really don't want to defend this guy. I mean, I don't want to. He said, you got to. You don't have a choice. You know, you take what we give you. I said, okay. So, this guy was a drunkard. He was. He had a number of convictions before that. He had a very high BAC. And I had a job to do. And when you're arrested, they give you a blood test.
At that time they did? At that time in the 70s? Or
yeah,
before
yeah,
70s?
Yeah. And the blood test, he was arrested about 11 o'clock, and he was brought to the station. And by the time they took the blood test, it was the next day.
Oh.
But the form that was filed had the day before.
Oh.
So the form itself was defective on its face. So I'm looking at it, and I know that it's defective. And sometimes it's very difficult to get a conviction unless you have one of these BAC tests. But I had a job to do. I knew the guy was guilty as heck. So I said, Your Honor, this form is defective, and so forth and so on. And the court agreed with me. And I was just kicking myself, but I said, hey, I got to do a job. Fortunately, the cop was really good because he had given him certain motor skills tests. And he was able to convince the jury that the guy was guilty. And he was found guilty on the cop's testimony. And as he was being led away, he was waving to me saying, I want to appeal. I said, yeah, right, with the next lawyer, not with me. That was a fun case.
Okay, well, you got into the
National Highway Traffic Safety Administration.
A lot of letters there. NHTSA.
NHTSA, yeah.
And so this is a government job now?
Yes.
How'd you do that? How'd you get into the government?
Well, they came to me.
Oh.
I had developed a specialty in highway safety, in alcohol and highway safety. And they were in the process of developing this new office in transportation on alcohol and highway safety. They recognized how important it was and how dangerous it was for drunk drivers. And they came to me and said, would you come down to Washington and head up the office? And I did. They expanded the office, and then they gave me a special job of the legislative and judicial officer of NHTSA. And my job was to go out to the various states. At that time, the only way in the states, the only way of getting evidence was through a cop's testimony. But in Scandinavia and in England, they had developed this program where they take a person's blood or breath, and depending on the content, they can determine whether or not a person is intoxicated. And
so the Scandinavians developed the criteria for having too much alcohol by either breathalyzer or
a blood test. Right.
And I assume initially they took the breathalyzer, and then did they always take a breath?
One or the other.
One or the other.
Yeah,
okay.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. If a person refused the breath test, then he would take the blood test. If he refused that, they had a statute on the books that said, if you refuse to take the tests, then you will be automatically penalized by having a 6 months license revocation. Okay, so you were kind of forced to take the test.
Now, this is all states, or this is a national
In
requirement?
the United States, they had none.
Oh, okay.
None of the states had.
None of the states had.
None of the states had it.
Okay.
And part of my job was to go out to the states and to get them to enact this legislation, where if a person is found to have at that point 0.15 BAC, he is assumed to be intoxicated.
Yeah.
Okay, it's an
And
assumption.
He is.
Right. When I left the Department of Transportation, and 3 years later, every state in the Union, other than Illinois and DC, had a BAC law.
Okay, good.
Plus that what we call the implied consent law. That's where if you don't take the tests, you have a 6 months revocation of your driver's license.
So this happened between 1970 and 1973.
Right.
You know, it strikes me as I had no idea that it was so. Well, of course, that's a while ago.
Yeah.
When we start thinking about it.
Now, the other job I had was teaching both judges and prosecutors that drunk drivers were not your buddy who had a couple of beers,
Yeah.
but more often than not, an alcoholic. And these were the guys that were on the road constantly and causing as many deaths as they were. Now, when we started on this program, the highway traffic safety deaths per year were around 50 to 60,000. And by the time we finished our programs, it came down to like 30,000.
Is that right?
Yeah, so we did a whole bunch of good things about getting drunks off the highway.
We went from 50 to 55,000 down to 30.
Right,
That's well, something happened like that when we went to the 55 miles speed limit too, as I recall. But this
actually went up after we changed it. The 55 was because of the gas restrictions.
Yeah.
Then it went up, and the deaths increased.
Yeah.
As the highway speed laws go up, deaths increase because you're going at a much higher rate of speed.
Well, that's remarkable to be able to reduce the.
I feel very good about that.
Yeah, and you had a lot to do with it, really.
I do.
Yeah.
One other thing that's important too, after I got out.
You got out of the NHTSA.
After I got out of NHTSA, one of the problems that we had in enforcing the laws was that you required some reason to believe to stop a vehicle and test the person. And because of that, you couldn't set up what's known as roadblocks. We have them now, where you literally stop all the vehicles and you test the vehicles, or the air, or the individuals as you go on. And because the law says you can't stop someone unless you have a reason to believe that the person has committed an offense or a crime, it was a big problem for us, because we knew that roadblocks was a very good manner in which to find drunk drivers.
Yeah.
So we developed a case, and we brought it all the way up to the Supreme Court to try to get an exception to the rule. Now, a lot of people don't realize there are a number of exceptions to rules.
Sure.
Like a stop and frisk law, where normally you can't frisk a person unless you have reason to believe that they're a danger. Okay. And the court at one point said, okay, we realize that police officers can be in a difficult situation. And so we're changing the rule to say if a police officer has a suspicion that a person may be armed, they'll have the right to stop and frisk.
Oh.
Now that's a deviation from the law. It's an exception. And the Supreme Court made another exception in this situation, and they said, we realize how important it is to have roadblocks, and we're going to make an exception and allow the roadblocks even though the cars that are stopped and examined don't normally reach the requirement of reason to believe. So that was a big win also.
Okay, well now, you moved to Fredericksburg, and what was the purpose of moving to Fredericksburg?
Well, we moved out of Fairfax when our kids left.
Yeah.
We had a big house, 5-bedroom house, and there was no purpose to it. Went to an apartment house in Alexandria, and we were there for a number of years, and my wife just didn't like apartment living. And in Fredericksburg, they had this 55 and above communities, which had these little houses in a nice community with people of our own age and so forth. And so we moved out there. Excuse me, and then after X number of years, we decided to come back to Fairfax, and we came here to Green Spring.
Well, why did you, excuse me, why did you choose Green Spring?
It served our purpose.
Yeah. Did you look at others, or did you?
Yes, we did.
Yeah.
You know, we felt that Green Spring was the
You had
best alternative.
Did you have your daughter check some out?
No, we did it ourselves.
Okay. But you finally, you looked at this and thought it was a good place to be.
Yes, and we have no problems whatsoever. We feel that it's definitely serving our purpose.
Well, now you're the president of the Democratic Club, Marvin,
Yes.
and you've been president for 2 or 3 years?
4 years.
4 years, huh?
Yeah.
And so you've had a lot of experience with the Democratic Party, I presume.
Yeah, I've been active politically for 70 years.
70
almost. Yeah, 70 years.
You've gotten involved with a lot of the politicians in the state or
Yeah,
local? Or?
yeah. Back in New York, I met Bobby Kennedy once when he was running for Senate, and was pretty active then.
Oh, okay.
But it was different. Politics was so much different then. One thing I learned when I got the job here in Washington, I didn't even know about it, but Nixon was the president at the time, and obviously I was an active Democrat. And my job was GS-15, which is about as high as you can get in the GS level. And I didn't know, but anybody getting a job at that point of GS-12 and above was vetted by the administration.
Oh.
I didn't know anything about it. I found out later that I had made a lot of good Republican friends on Long Island, a lot of state senators. Mm-hmm. And I had been vetted, but they went to these guys and they said, Wagner's good. Okay. Go with him. He knows what he's doing. Yeah. Even though I was an active Democrat. Yeah. So my ability to get on with Republicans and work with them closely turned out to be quite good for me later on.
Yeah. It's more difficult now.
It's such a difficult time. I've tried to work with the Republicans, and let me say this right now. Don Young, who is the president of the Republican Club, and I are friends. Yeah. You know, we don't see each other very much outside, but we talk to each other, we discuss things. And we are now going to sponsor on November 11th a 100th anniversary of Armistice Day of the World War I. And we're going to do that jointly, and we're going to approach the American Legion to work with us.
I'm the MC of the Veterans Day program here, and we have an annual program in the chapel. Mm-hmm. We're going to do it on the 10th, I think. We're going to do it on the Saturdays. Veterans Day is actually on the Sunday. Uh-huh. So we didn't want to try to do it on Sunday in the chapel because of the services. Right. But so where do you, well, are you going to be competing with me?
No. Well, let's do it together.
Okay.
There's no reason why we can't do it together. We're going to approach the American Legion and ask them to work with us. Yeah. We've already taken the conference center because we expect this to be pretty big. Yeah. And we're going to approach maybe the governor or whomever to be our lead speaker. And we want, it's also Veterans Day, so we want a lot of veterans to work with us. But the point I'm trying to make is, and Gray, we'll talk about working with you guys. We're able to work together, the Democratic Party, or the Democratic Club and the Republican Club are working together. And that to me is so important. I wish the national government would be able to do more of that.
Me too. Well, we're out of time, Marvin. We're completely out of time.
I'm sorry.
We don't have a minute. We're completely out of time. And I thank you very much for coming.
My pleasure.
I hope
Thank
you've
you.
enjoyed talking with me
I
as
have.
much as I've enjoyed talking with you. And learning about your early life gives me a much greater appreciation of you as a person than I've had before. I mean, not that
Thank you, Gray.
that I haven't, but I really, when people tell me about coming out of through the Depression and how difficult it was and all and how they climbed out, I appreciate that. I admire it.